David, what podcast do you listen to?
Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast.
That is a tagline podcast that goes by the tagline of
Actual evolutionary psychology by, are you going to fill
actual.
it in?
I was gonna ask if I was starting to think about if there's other
Usually you
pod.
fill it in.
I know I do, but I was starting wondering the question. I said like that. Are there podcasts that don't have taglines, and maybe the ones that actually I
So
don't know.
something got garbled there. Okay, well that's pretty standard for us. Anyway,
Okay, but
enjoy.
we're actual evolutionary psychologists by that wasn't grammatical. Well, the tagline is actual evolutionary psychology by actual evolutionary psychologists. But what I was going to say is we are actual evolutionary psychologists doing actual evolutionary psychology.
That's correct.
Okay,
And
we'll
enjoy
do.
that then.
Okay. Um, David, today we're talking to Luke Glowacki, who is also the other half of the Omo Valley Research Project, which is super awesome, both doing really great basic research and also making the world slightly better and much more better than many of us basic scientists. So it was great to
Yeah.
talk to Luke.
Yeah, this was a really fun conversation. Way more fun than Tolstoy's War and Peace. He wrote War and Peace, right? I'm getting that right.
Yeah, you've been talking a lot about reading boring long books. Is that what's going on? You've been reading War and Peace.
Yeah, I've been reading War and Peace because
Uh,
I'm a really sophisticated
I see. This is
person.
what it. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I've read it multiple times, and
I see.
pretty much every work of Tolstoy, every great work of literature, I've read and
Sure,
mastered.
sure.
Because
You're
I
that
have a
kind
lot
of
of
guy.
I'm just that kind of guy.
Yeah.
Anyways, if you didn't like the book War and Peace, you will certainly love this conversation about War and
Mm.
Peace because it is just full of fascinating insights. We get into mongooses or mongoose,
Yeah.
and in fact, whether it's mongoose is or mongoose.
I think it should
Um,
be mongoose.
I would agree.
Yeah.
Anyways,
And Luke, I just wanted like the context is Luke has a wonderful paper called The Evolution of Peace. And it's an inversion of the usual, like war needs to be explained, but peace doesn't. And it's sort of, I love this idea that you invert that and say, really, the thing that needs to be explained is peace. And I love that approach. And that's part of what we talk about here today.
yes, and you will really want to listen to more than a piece of this episode
Ooh,
about
zinger,
peace.
David. Okay.
Yeah, just it
You're
comes from
on.
all, yeah. It's because
You've
I've
been
been reading
doing
so
so.
much great literature. That's what helps me
There you go.
make
That's
these
what I
great
was.
jokes.
Fantastic. So, without further ado, here is David and myself and Luke Glowacki talking about all things war and peace.
Enjoy.
Computer. Today, no, I'll start over. Okay, so today we're very happy to have Luke Glowacki. Luke, you are, and we can edit this out if I'm wrong, but I believe you are an academic grandchild of Jane Goodall. Is that correct?
Yeah, maybe. My PhD supervisor was Richard Wrangham, but Jane
Right.
Goodall was not technically Richard's PhD supervisor. She was the
Ah.
supervisor of the site.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
So it's a little bit fuzzy. Okay, because I
yeah,
actually always assumed that Richard's
Maybe
advisor
your
was Jane.
academic great aunt
Yeah.
yeah. Maybe that's a
ish.
good way to think about it.
Alloparented. You were,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
All right.
Okay. Did she have direct students?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll chat GPT that. Or somebody
Um,
can look it up while they're listening. Yeah. Richard was somebody who was studying he was there because he was studying chimps. Yeah.
yeah, that's right.
Okay.
But a little known fact about Richard is he also spent like a year working in the like Central African forests with horticulturalists and foragers there as
Oh,
well, sometime after his PhD.
okay. So when you were a student of his, which department was that in?
So I started in the anthropology department at Harvard, biological anthropology, which transitioned into human evolutionary biology. So it's separated
Right.
from the anthropology department.
Yeah. And you are currently in anthro or psych department.
Yeah, I'm
Okay.
currently in an anthropology department at Boston University.
Right. Fantastic. Yeah, because I mean, your students, they're doing so much psychological stuff and not to like, be not to be psychology centric, but it just I mean the division between anthro and psych
Yeah,
is just sort of
the disciplinary boundaries or departmental boundaries are just like historic artifacts. I think if you're, doing good sort of research today on humans, you're going
yeah.
to be crossing boundaries.
Yeah, yeah.
You may be closer to what political scientists are doing in some cases than say for your own selves than psychologists or economists than psychologists. The way the fields work. If we were designing them today from the ground up, we probably wouldn't start with the departments we have now.
No,
Yeah,
probably
I,
not.
I remember when we were chatting at a conference, you mentioned that you started out interested in philosophy and then gradually found your way into the evolutionary behavioral sciences. I'm curious if you could elaborate on that journey and what might have precipitated it.
Yeah, I feel so fortunate for the sort of serendipity that led me to the evolutionary behavioral sciences. I didn't take any classes in anthropology or psychology as an undergrad. I thought the closest you could get to understanding human cognition was Kant. Just deep reflection about the structures of the mind. And that if you really wanted to understand our species, you had to spend years just sort of like locked in a battle with yourself, thinking through things. So it was only just through sort of like happenstance that I read a book about cognitive science, and it was actually criticizing evolutionary psychology. And I don't remember the book now. It was an academic press, but I was like, oh, wow, this is so cool. There is a world in which people are thinking about human behavior and like how we evolved and like studying it. Like, I want to know more about that world. So
Wow.
That's funny.
I got very, very fortunate and I just started knocking on doors. Like how can I get into actually studying human behavior instead of just like, doing the awesome work that philosophers do, which is mostly just thinking and occasionally writing, but actually
Yeah.
like getting into the weeds of designing studies and, thinking about what the results of our research tells us about humans.
Yeah.
Hmm. I love that you were turned on to evolutionary psychology by a critic of evolutionary psychology inadvertently. I don't think we've ever had that origin story
Yeah.
on the podcast before.
I think Christina, it was Christina. I was just thinking we had Christina because Christina
Mhm.
also it was a very it was like it was mentioned and it was presented as like obviously wrong. And she's like, that sounds awesome.
Yeah, I'm like there's really something to it. And
Yeah.
once you adopt an evolutionary framework, I mean, so many things I feel like just pop into place. Like your
Yeah.
understanding of our species really deepens. And I often think like it's sort of impossible. Like, so they say nothing in biology makes sense except for evolution. Well, I think a lot of things in human behavior don't really make sense unless you think about our evolutionary history.
Yeah. I think for David and I and a lot of people we've talked to, it's been sort of there's a dissatisfaction. At some point, it's almost like authoritarian intellectualism, right? Where it's sort of like, this is what's true. It's actually a very Kantian point, actually. Like Kant was sort of like, we can't, don't do that. It's sort of
Yeah.
like, and but for you, do you have an idea of sort of was it this thing of like I'm not I feel uncomfortable just like accepting a premise, like, and I want to know why the premise is there. Or what do you have a thought about why you were attracted to evolutionary stuff?
Um, well, it was a framework that explained things. So there's,
Mm,
just big patterns in the world. You see big patterns by age, you see big patterns by sex, you see big patterns by social status. And it was a framework that actually like lays out very clear predictions that you can test that seem to have a lot of explanatory power. So
yeah,
that's what really drew it to me is like I'm a person that want to understand why the world is the way it is. And
yeah,
this is a framework that really provides you a mechanism to understand, where we come from and why today it looks the way, we have clothes, we drive, we use the computer and all that, but essentially like we're still animals. We're just
yeah,
cultural animals. So a lot of the same sort of principles that apply that shape the behavior of other species also shape humans.
yeah. And for that, we're gonna come to really recent, maybe as a way to get into things, which is you had a very recent paper called The Evolution of Peace. And to my mind, it was lovely and sort of uh, uh, subversive in a way, in a good way. And it's exactly on the same point where it's sort of so much is made about the evolution of war and needing to explain conflict. And the point of this paper is the title, is the evolution of peace. Can you talk a little bit about um, either that paper specifically or sort of how that paper is part of sort of your what you do generally? Yeah.
Yeah, so I sort of I'll just talk a little bit sort of about what I do.
Yeah.
With my focus on intergroup relationships, conflict, and cooperation, I think about like I think with humans, like we have really good theory, or mostly like on the evolution of cooperation. We have pretty decent theory on like the evolution of intergroup conflict. So these are theories that are designed to sort of apply across taxa. Some of them are more or less specific to humans, but we don't have a lot of sort of theory like linking sort of our evolutionary biological explanations, say for a psychology for dominance or for status or imbalances of power with how the
Mm,
real world humans as cultural creatures operate. There's a gap sort of between, say, the evolutionary explanations and in some ways the sort of more proximate psychological
mm,
explanation. So like dehumanization may be like a maybe one proximate explanation for why people are more likely to contribute in violence, but we have a gap between the sort of biological evolutionary theory and the psychological processes. And in that gap, I think culture is really, really important. So I
mm,
sort of focus on thinking about how do we understand that separation between those two? How can we understand the role that culture has in both shaping institutions, say, to promote war, promote cooperation, are inhibiting it, and how might culture then have acted on our own evolved minds?
mm,
And a lot of the things I think we sort of take for granted, including things around war and peace, are actually, evolved cultural technology, specifically peace. Peace is not just the absence of war. So the vast majority of social species, if two groups of some social primate meet in the forest, they typically just avoid each other.
right.
They don't interact. And most people would not call that peace. They call it avoidance. There's something really unusual with individuals from distinct social groups coming together without having to negotiate those relationships individually. I'm at
Right.
Boston University, I can meet a student at Northeastern or MIT, and I don't have to be hesitant or worried and figure out how they're going to treat me, or, a person from China or Russia or any
Yeah.
other place. We can have an expectation of how we should treat each other and how they're going to treat me. And it creates all sorts of opportunities for positive sum exchanges. Then, and the conditions that get that, I think they depend crucially on cultural technologies. And like any sort of technology, you can think about, fire making, ritual technologies. It's the result of cultural evolutionary processes. So you can study peace as the result of these processes, and then you can hypothesize about when it would have come about in our lineage.
Right. Yeah, that's awesome. Huge amount of stuff to talk about. I always, just to follow up on the point about people not being like chimps, to kind of bring back to the Richard Wrangham thing, is that I teach intro to psych, and it's like 700 undergrads in a huge hall, and they're like freshmen, and they always laugh when I tell them, if you all sat down and you were chimps, you wouldn't be like sitting quietly, like it would be violent, right? And they laugh at that. But just taking that point for granted is something that I think like an evolutionary approach pokes on, right? And just says, oh, this is actually a weird thing about us that
Mhm.
nobody knows anybody in that room, yet everybody sat down, and that would be really weird
Yeah.
for any other primate.
Yeah, including what a lot of people assume it would be the case for bonobos, that they'd just be,
Mm,
having a massive orgy, but the
yeah.
actual, reality of bonobos is there would be just tons and tons of violence. It wouldn't be
Mm,
probably as lethal or serious as chimpanzees, but it would certainly be, a very aggressive, tense, scary place. So humans
yeah.
are, extremely unusual for our capacity so the term that's often used is tolerance, just to
Mm,
tolerate strangers, not to have high affect or high arousal around strangers. And that's certainly something that like we evolved the neurobiological machinery that allows us to interact with strangers without like immediately, being all the defensive.
yeah.
Mhm.
Before we get to the cultural part, which is a big thing to bite off, when we just talk about the biological thing, we talked about two different things. One is sort of a comparative approach where we look at bonobos or chimps or think about a common ancestor that, and we can kind of infer here's what an ancestral state was. And then we have to have some quote unquote biological explanation for how we got to where we are now, having the proximate
Mhm.
phenotype we have. Another version is less about that comparative approach and is more like an adaptationist approach, which is just sort of given the way we are now, let's reverse engineer sort of the software. We in reality, there's sort of a complementary approach, and many people do both things. Where do you put your own work in that continuum? Have you done both kinds, or how do you typically sort of think about that, or is that even a false distinction?
Yeah, so I would say the way most people practice, most, big thinking, evolutionary behavioral sciences scholars sort of take aspects of both approaches. If you want to know what things are just unique to humans, you have to look at other species.
Yeah.
Right? And then you can start with, okay, so humans have this peculiar trait, whatever it is, and you can start to figure out just logically what things you need to get it. But you can also look at other species to see, because often there's, multiple pathways to some particular trait. So,
Mm,
maybe you have whatever trait it is because there was selection for X, but maybe some other species says you can get it for selection for Y. And this is why, at least in evolutionary anthropology, you typically are really concerned with, like, do meerkats have lethal intergroup violence? Are there
right.
species that have it without imbalances of power? So, in humans, the leading theory is that, we have a psychology that goes very deep to be sensitive to imbalances of power, and from when you can turn those imbalances of power into a benefit for yourself. But if you find species that, say, have lethal intergroup aggression, similar to, like, proto-war without imbalances of power, suggests maybe there's different pathways and we should rethink whether it's
Mm.
the best explanation for humans. So I think
And
in order to do good evolutionary behavioral sciences, you really do have to take aspects of both
Yeah.
approaches.
I want to pick up one of the loose loose ends there. Do in
Yeah.
fact other species have lethal intergroup violence without any kind of imbalance of power?
Um, I think, which species is it? Crested macaques. There was a paper that came out recently. I'm going to say there's a couple of species that it looks like it does. It depends on the particular type of intergroup violence. So, like banded mongoose, for instance, they have really high rates of lethal intergroup violence where essentially they live in these large social groups, and the female from one social group will leave per group and go out, in search of mates from another group, but all the males will follow along and they'll meet another group of bandit mongoose and they form a line. You can look at the pictures as wild. It's like a battle line, and they just have like a giant, giant scrum. And
Mm.
typically the deaths that result from this are like one of them gets separated from the rest of their group, and three or four of the opposing group pile on and kill them, but it's all in the midst of,
Mm.
20 mongoose versus 20 mongoose. And at the same time, the female is off on the side mating with her preferred mate
Oh
of
yeah,
the
I'm looking
of
at
Interesting.
the other group.
pictures. Yeah, it looks
Wow,
like literally it looks like a rugby scrum. Like it literally looks they're lining up. Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
interesting. Well, it's I mean it's interesting to note that when deaths do occur, it does follow somewhat this imbalance of power logic, where it's usually three or four males ganging up on one, and there is kind of a mini imbalance of power in that little section of the skirmish. So there's at least
Yeah.
something to the idea. I mean, I do think that the logic is really compelling in that you don't want to risk death unless you can be sure that your side is going to win. And in the case where you're
Mhm.
going to be sure that your side is going to win and you're going to face few costs is if there's a huge imbalance of power favoring your side.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, it is still pretty interesting that they all line up that way, and it seems like they're for the most part pretty evenly matched. What do you think? Do you have an idea of what's going? I know this is not necessarily your area of expertise, but is there a reigning theory in the literature of what explains this?
The lining up like that.
Hmm. The
Yeah.
lining up
So
and why they seem to fight with each other despite being pretty evenly
yeah.
matched. And
Well, I think they're fighting with each other over, control of reproductively valuable females. So right,
Okay.
they want to control access to that female. That's why they're following that female. They're trying to coerce her into the
Hmm.
back of the group. You're then, you encounter, and I expect you may have a very similar dynamic in many other species that have a sort of similar pattern where you line, they're probably not thinking they just line up, but they're just positioning each other on the basis of like more simple heuristics of make sure I don't have an unfamiliar mongoose behind me, make
Right.
sure I can see as many as possible. And I imagine that's something that just creates a line. And then I imagine most of the attacks aren't necessarily driven by the thought at that point we're going to, try to kill another, but they're just, fighting each other as an emergent behavior to try to make sure that you're not actually being victim of an attack.
Right.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Interesting.
John Williams. Yeah, John Williams. No, George Williams. Different Williams. Both great. George Williams, who wrote Adaptation, Natural Selection, was like really. He talked about schools of fish and how we shouldn't attribute schools of fish to anything other than the fish just not wanting to be eaten, and they just sort of form this ball as an emergent property, and that really reminds me of what you're saying, Luke.
Yeah.
There. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Would you say that the way to understanding it is, there are two aspects to intergroup conflict. One is the expected costs to one side of the conflict to engaging in that conflict. This would be like risk of injury or death, and the other would be the expected benefits of engaging in the conflict. And usually, the thing that just determines going into a conflict in an imbalance of power situation is, low expected costs. If you were clearly more formidable, more numerous than the antagonist, then the costs are going to be lower, and that's going to, in many cases, precipitate conflict. But in the case of the mongoose, is that I think
Mongoose. Yeah, the bandit mongoose.
bandit mongoose? In
That's
the
the
case of the bandit
plural
mongoose,
mongoose. Is that right? Is that plural?
Mongoose,
That's
I
fantastic.
think.
I'm really sorry to interrupt, but
mongoose.
I
I
really
didn't know
did
that.
not know that, and I'm
I
really
mean, maybe I'm making it up.
no,
I don't know.
no. You are the evolutionary biologist. We are bumbling
Yeah, we'll
people.
defer to
So
you on
no. This is fantastic. I feel like this is the
yeah.
best thing I've learned today.
It's
In
a great
addition to
great
everything
Well, you're
else.
probably going to Google it after and find out. Like I'm just
No, what
like,
is the plural
like
of
making it up. I
we're
don't
gonna
know.
Yeah.
yeah,
All right. So
great.
the
This is
bandit
I'm
mongoose.
so glad. Yeah, no. It's like pronouncing the Zatwasi, for example. Yeah.
So normally, a high expected cost would precipitate conflict when there's a balance of power and the cost would be low. But with the monkeys, it seems like what might be going on is it's less about the expected cost and more about the expected benefit. There's a very clear Darwinian benefit in terms of, conflict over females, and it may be that, the cost might be high, but on the other hand, the benefit is also really high, and that might be explaining why this conflict is taking place despite each side being, pretty evenly matched. Do you buy
Mm.
that
Yeah,
logic, or
I
is that?
think that's a fair way to think about it. The way we think about most species that this sort of lethal coalitionary intergroup violence evolves is that just the costs are really, really low because you have clear imbalance of power. Chimpanzees, it's an average of around 8 chimpanzee attackers to one victim. So the odds of any of you suffering any serious injury or costs are pretty low. But in bandit mongoose, it's really different dynamic, and it could be because the benefits are just so high in this case because you really are trying to control access to a reproductively valuable female.
Mm. And so just to connect the dots, Richard Wrangham's like the imbalance of power hypothesis, can you just talk maybe just for a second about that? And was that what you started thinking about that eventually gets you to this paper about the evolution of
Yeah,
speech?
the imbalance of power hypothesis, I think, is just one of the sort of like most beautiful, elegant theories out there to explain why you have, coalitionary violence between groups that's lethal. So the idea is that in species where territory is tied to some benefit in the currency of natural selection, that's reproductive benefits, even though it can be down stream, and you have species that have a particular grouping pattern, fission fusion. So these are not species that are solitary. So,
Mm,
tigers are solitary. They live in the forest primarily by themselves. You're never going to see coalitionary violence. Many primates are group living there, but they live in troops. So these are stable units where it's always, your whole life is with 40 other individuals. Anytime you meet
mm.
another group, it's with 40 individuals. So the costs are similar in bandit mongoose, however we're calling it
No,
now. The
thank
costs are
you.
going to be very high. But in the
Mm,
case of Some species, you have a grouping pattern that's not a troop. It's fission fusion, where so you can think of humans, where you spend a lot of time in a large group, but people are often coming and going. And when they're going, they may be in a group of one individual, two or three, so they're in small sub parties.
Mm.
But you're neighbored by other groups. So you may be out on, if you're a chimpanzee, you may be foraging by yourself because it's a period of resource scarcity, and you come to the periphery of your territory, and your neighboring community has a
Mhm.
large fig tree. So they're all together at that time. So, you can encounter you as a lone individual, potentially 8 individuals from the neighboring community. So you have an imbalance of power then. So it's very easy for that larger party or that larger community to attack and kill that lone individual with very low cost. But in order to have the motivational system to do it, there has to be some benefits to it. So you're
Mm.
not going to see it in species in which, access to territory doesn't really pay off in terms of reproduction. So you're going to find it in places where resources are really sort of heterogeneous and variable. So this is the leading theory of why some species have a pattern that's eerily sort of similar to war, including chimpanzees.
I see. So it's coming back to this idea of we can look at predictions of what the function or cause of something like war is, what its evolutionary quote unquote explanation is, by looking at the distribution of where do we, in what species do we find it?
Yeah, so that would be
And
one of the ways. Do
right,
you, mhm.
exactly. Yeah. And it sounds like that's been one of the approaches. And it sounds like there's quite a bit of that data, that kind of data of that it's kind of cashing out the prediction.
Yeah, so there are several species that have, lethal coalitionary intergroup violence. It's a bit of a mouthful, so sort of
Yeah.
proto-war, including our close relatives, the chimpanzees. Bonobos don't have this pattern of behavior. So big mystery has been why bonobos don't. And one of the leading hypotheses is that they just have lower rates of fission fusion than
Mm.
chimpanzees due to the fact that their territory is slightly different than chimpanzees. Their evolutionary
Mm.
territory is slightly different than chimpanzees, that it's a more resource abundant area. And this is hypothesis. There's some debate about it. So when you find humans are doing something sort of eerily similar, and we also, I mean, we're very famous as a fission fusion species. You can think about central place foraging. We all come together at a night, in the evening, if you're a group of hunter-gatherers sharing food, but during the day, you're often in smaller work parties as a solitary forager, a solitary hunter, or with a few other individuals, creating the opportunity for fission fusion. But it hasn't been, a lot of the work is sort of like speculative. Was this important in human evolution? How deep was it important in human evolution? If we, have a model, say, similar to like savanna baboons, as many people think the Australopiths would have been, then maybe that's not a good model for fission and fusion. So maybe we didn't actually have fission and fusion for an important part of our evolutionary history. So a lot of it is sort of
Mm.
speculative, and there hasn't been as many sort of clean tests
Okay.
as we would like.
Yeah. But just so that I'm being clear,
Yeah.
fission fusion, the idea is like cows just sort of intuitively don't need to fission fusion because the distribution of how they make their living, it's just all sort of there. So ungulates, for example, they're
Yeah,
just all
or
sort of,
or if they do fission fusion, that there's not a motivation or benefit, there's not a real benefit to attacking
r-
members of other groups. Because you can imagine like many herd species may have some sort of, I don't know that you would call it fission fusion times where they're
right. Well, they might all
aggregate
get
more due
together.
to
Yeah.
breeding,
Yeah. Lekking.
during
Yeah, it might be
breeding
a lek or
season.
something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
during breeding season or something, but there's
Right.
not a real benefit from group. And maybe that's because they're not group living in the same way that we think
Right.
members of one group attacking and killing members of
Yeah.
other groups. If
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
if they do, and I imagine some of them do have lethal violence, when they're headbutting each other, but then it's going to be between dyads. It's not going to be
Right.
coalitionary, which is what's really unusual. Is, many mammalian species have, violence where they kill members of their same species, but what's unusual is that it's a group killing
Yeah.
members of the same species.
And
Yeah.
so
It's
is
okay.
the idea that we don't see this in say herbivores that eat grass, it's because the distribution of resources is not very lopsided. Like there's no real
Yeah.
benefit to like a herd of cattle attacking a rival herd because there's plenty of grass everywhere, and there's not going to be a real payoff to that kind of behavior. Is that the idea?
Yeah, I would also say they're not a group living species in the way primates are.
Okay.
Mm,
They're living with others, but there's no clear in-group, out-group boundaries.
right. It's
Hmm.
it's so interesting because I mean, on the one hand, what I love about an evolutionary approach is that even something like are we fusion fission, and we were talking about that because we're talking about groups and like conflict. But we can talk about fission fusion as a consequence, right? It's coming back to this point of we take nothing for granted. It's a consequence of like just the ecology or what the environment is like. Do you need to fusion, or not? So I think that that's really cool, but it does add this complication of, on one hand, you're talking about like the group psychology or like, because groups in some sense are like caused by the mental representation, which then causes the behavior. So it becomes this complicated thing. Like, unsurprisingly, groups are complicated, which is we both have to deal with like the ecology to think about like, well, why would there even be selection for conflict? But then at the same time, it's this thing of many species don't have the requisite psychology to produce the behavior either. So how do we explain that too? Yeah.
Yeah, it's really fun to think about because you can think about, savanna baboons. They live in these sort of large groups, but they're eating, seeds from the grasses. So they don't really
Mm,
have this sort of, as far as I understand it, like distinct in-group, out-group
mm,
psychology where, access to territory really matters for reproduction. But then you think about
mm,
chimpanzees where, they like to eat, figs from fig trees. So if it's time where they're all, where there's abundant figs, they're going to spend most of their days together. But then in a season where it's not quite as abundant, there's not nearly as much food. They're in much smaller parties. So they're both vulnerable, but they may have a reason if they're in a larger party then to predate on their neighbors. I'm working
mm.
on a paper sort of like laying out some ideas about the evolution of war. And one of the sections is like, why don't off of Sapolsky's, why don't zebras
Yeah.
get ulcers? Is why don't like zebras wage war?
Great question. Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
that, or rabbits or whatever.
Yeah.
Why don't
Sounds cute.
squirrels
Yeah.
wage war? Squirrels have violence, they're super aggressive, but
Yeah.
why don't they wage war? And some of the aspects in order to wage war, you have to have a psychology to engage in coalitionary aggression, use it strategically. So that requires certain evolutionary preconditions to be met.
Right.
Mm. Do you think that carnivory might be one such precondition, and that if you have the cognitive machinery necessary to coordinate with other members of your group to aggressively attack a prey animal, that those types of abilities could be parlayed into a context of intergroup violence? Whereas if you don't have any kind of predation instincts or abilities, then it's going to be harder to evolve the kinds of coordination abilities and socio-cognitive abilities necessary to get together in a group and count on the fact that you can all act in synchrony and cooperate with one another and be confident that each member of the group is going to have your back in some sense. Uh,
No, I don't think it's necessary. I think,
okay.
I think there is something appealing sort of about, hunting as a pathway to war. And I think this is one of the major sort of hypotheses that the imbalance of power sort of overturned because you have many species that, are carnivores to more or lesser extent that don't have anything like it. And then you can think about some species that maybe aren't heavily carnivores, like some species of chimpanzees or potentially bonobos, if we end up finding that they do
Mm,
have rating, which some people suspect that aren't carnivores, are gorillas, for instance.
Yeah.
There's been several cases of guerrilla coalitionary violence against a
mhm,
lone outgroup individual.
mm,
So it's less a case of like where the larger group goes and looks for like a patrol for individuals to take over the territory, and more like a larger group is being followed by a lone individual, and then they pile on and beat that individual to nearly to death or to death. Um, and they're not carnivores by any stretch of the imagination.
Is it territory then? Is it the exclusivity of like why don't squirrels go to war?
Well, I don't think they're group living in the same way.
Right. And and this
You
is the
know?
problem, right? It's like a chicken and
Yeah.
egg thing because it's like, well, why aren't they group living? And does it come back to then, is it the distribution of resources
How
or
about, they control territories in the sense
I
that you may
see.
have you have a nice oak
Acreage,
in
right? Yeah.
your yard, and you have
Right.
one or two squirrel nests in it that they want to control. So
I
they'll,
see.
chase away squirrels from other,
Mm,
squirrels that are trying to encroach on their territory, but you don't have the opportunity for, you know, four nests from these three to gang up with each other and
right.
chase
Right.
away and kill some other squirrel. Now, it may be, if when I started my PhD research in 2009, many of the species that have lethal intergroup aggression now, we didn't actually know about it at the time,
Sure.
or it wasn't well documented.
Yeah.
So it may be the case in 20 years we find out that, some sort of like hypersocial population of squirrels
Yeah.
somewhere, does. So it may look different, but
Right.
but for the most part, I think the way we understand that why the vast majority of species, although they kill each other, or why many mammalian species kill each other, don't do it as parts of coalitions. It's just the fact that you have to be social and typically territorial.
Right.
And the
And
reason you're
yeah.
territorial is because territory is associated with access to resources that you can
Mm.
convert into reproduction.
Right. So this is the Harcourt de Wall classic sort of coalitions in humans and non-humans. This was sort of in the 80s and 90s. There was just this like social brain hypothesis of really multi-agent conflict is really difficult. It's really zoologically rare. There's many situations where you look at something like classically elephant seals, like it's very male reproductive success is extremely skewed. There's a whole beach full of female elephant seals, and one male elephant seal is fights all the other males and gets access to all of them. And from a coalitional species perspective, it's insane because two or three, a beta
Yeah.
and whatever, could just gang up on that male, but they don't because they just
Yeah.
cannot do it. And it's so weird. So this idea that there's sort of like it's hard computationally to do this is, I think, was a really important idea. Has that been part of your thinking, and is that outdated now, or how do you
Yeah,
feel?
no, well, I think it's certainly true. The vast majority of lethal aggression you're going to see is, all those, exciting examples of two elephant seals, two horses going
Mm,
at it,
yeah,
two lions, two
slow
deer.
mo.
It's
Yeah,
typically, yeah,
yeah.
it's typically dyadic, but I'm not sure that computation's really the limiting factor because
Mm,
presumably if the environment is such that it favors the prerequisites for it, and there's sufficient payoff, then you are going to involve the computational
right.
machinery,
Yeah.
so
Mm,
you may have to have other things necessarily like, the conditions for which there to sort of be stable groups or stable coalitions,
right.
within it. How do you not get betrayed? If a group of betas join together to overthrow the alpha seal, how does one of them not get betrayed? So I
Right.
think that if the evolutionary payoffs are there over enough time, that we do see this paper or this behavior evolve and, distant taxa. So I think it's not like an insurmountably high barrier.
I see. So it's sort of like it's obviously like a maximum if in this possibility space of like phenotypes. It's hard to get to, and not every species gets to it, but it's not a thing of there's any simple like one factor to why they don't. It's just you need sort of the right constellation of either the environment is such that like free riders get selected out automatically, or there's enough sort of cognitive complexity in the species for other reasons
Yeah.
that might be even historical, that keeping track of sort of reciprocity or free riders is already sort of there enough. It's all sort of not, there's no sort of clear magic bullet per se.
Yeah, I think that that's fair. I also just want to say at this point, I feel like our theorizing on the evolution of coalitionary violence, lethal coalitionary violence, is not as refined as it should be in the
Mm,
wake of just a lot of other data on species coming out. I feel like that this is a
mm,
chance, this is a time for us to really sort of do more theory building.
mm.
The imbalance of power is like dominant and beautiful. It's elegant. It explains so much, but I'm not sure it explains everything we're seeing right now. Or even if it does answers questions at these other levels that you're asking. Well, why
Yeah.
don't some species
Yeah.
develop it? So so I don't think we have all the answers theoretically at
Right,
all.
because it seems like the question that Dave was getting at is a separate question, but very related. So we're originally talking about violence between groups, where a coalition from one group will gang up on a number of individuals from the other group. But there's also the question of coalitional violence within a group. So why don't the betas in a troop of elephant seals get together and overthrow the alpha? It would presumably be in their reproductive interests to do that. Why don't they? Why don't we see coalitions within a group, fighting with other members of the group? And it seems to me that that is a related question, and perhaps they're correlated. If you have coalitional violence within a group, you also are more likely to see coalitional violence between a group. I know, in chimpanzees, for example, they form alliances and they often can gang up on the male within a group. Well, if they have that ability, why not, parlay that to between group violence as well?
Yeah,
Is
it's
that a
I
factor?
love that example because this is
Yeah.
actually one of the things I think about in trying to explain why don't bonobos
Mm.
have sort of the lethal rating that you see in chimpanzees. So the one is just that they have they don't have as much imbalance of power, but another hypothesis is that they don't have as many male coalition or they don't have as strong of male coalitions as you see in chimpanzees. And maybe that's due to, some other feature, but also they have, it's been reported to me, I'm not a bonobo researcher at all, but bonobo females are very dominant and will often sort of like beat up and break up nascent coalitions. So it may just be that some of the proximate circumstances aren't there. Perhaps if you took away all the bonobo females, then you would have ratings sort of merge. But without, with the strong females that are breaking up male coalitions, maybe you just don't have the right sort of group coalesce that then, has enough sort of alignment of interests and stability to go out on a raid against another bonobo group. So I think this is a time that really we should be doing some more theory refinement. That,
Yeah.
I thought we had most of these sort of like big picture issues settled 15 years ago, and it's turning out that, new data leads to new theory. So it's a really exciting time to be working in this area.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I mean, intergroup conflict seems like it's such a straightforward selection pressure thing, like foraging or mating. And it's obviously studied in lots of animals. It's pretty easy to observe. I mean, and I say that not being in the forest, being next to conflict, but it's relatively easy to observe. And so yeah, it's amazing that we still don't really have great theories. And you mean theories sort of at every level, right? Like in the sense of, I mean, obviously, we don't have very good theories psychologically about the mental software in any species, but you even mean just sort of like the evolved prerequisites, like we're talking
Yeah.
about, or even what the function or even ecological correlates, right?
Yeah. Like
Wow.
would you have predicted that bandit mongoose would
Right.
have if you didn't know anything about their
Yeah.
Right.
behavior, do you have a
Yeah.
model that's going to predict why they have it? But let's say other species of mongoose don't have it.
Right. Right.
You want a theory that does that. And I don't
Exactly.
know that we have that right now.
Yeah. That's fantastic. Where does the evolution of peace then come into this?
So I really started thinking about it. I mean, just like in the first week or several weeks of my field work,
Hmm.
and I wanted to study decentralized war. So that if you want to study human war, most people will do it through like experiments or something like that, or you'll work with chimpanzees and do sort of armchair theorizing about humans. But I wanted to actually try to do field studies in a context that was as close as possible as we could get to like, so-called ancestral conditions. So it means, war outside of states, out of militaries, outside of, formal institutions, hierarchy, generals, anything like that. So I ended up working in East Africa, right at the border of South Sudan and Kenya and Ethiopia in a region called the Elimi Triangle with a group called the Nengatam. And, I'm like, oh, I'm gonna like, collect lots of data on like the cause of the war. I'm gonna test what hypotheses are out there. It's gonna be amazing. And then like several weeks in, there was I was doing daily labor, just digging a water hole, and you start hearing, all this cheering and clapping, the sort of stuff you may hear like in your campus office if you hear like a student parade outside or something. So I climb up out of the water hole, what's going on? And you can hear people firing AK-47s, sort of in excitement. It's got a different pattern than an actual like in defense of a raid, and was like oh, a group of raiders is coming back. They're coming back with a bunch of cattle that they stole from the Turkana. So everybody that afternoon, people are just jubilant, they're so excited, gather under a big shade tree, everyone's hanging out. It's really like a party. And they slaughter one of the cows, and everyone's like, oh, pastoralists must eat meat all the time because that's what they live off. But actually pastoralists do not eat meat that often. They tend to You'll consume a lot of dairy products or grain that they're growing or trade for and typically save their livestock. So everyone's eating just tons of cow, fresh beef roasted on the fire. Everybody's happy. It's a big party. And, it was really struck me then at the point was, in the people who had successfully captured these cattle, everyone's singing to them, like all the women are singing and praising them. All the guys are sort of honoring them. The elders are giving speeches like, this is the future. These are our warriors. Like they're bringing glory to us. And if you're successful in killing somebody, you get honorific scars, you get status, you go through all these rituals, you become a new person essentially. You get a new name. And it really struck me as the question is like in these particular conditions, like actually the challenge is not to explain why there's conflict. I want people to go out and raid. I like fresh cow if I'm hungry. So I want those people to go raid. I want our cows to be fatter because they chase away the enemy and get access to grazing lands. The real challenge in these conditions is how do you so once you're in this sort of like situation, how do you get groups to stop fighting? How do you
Mm.
change the costs and benefits? How do you change the incentives so people stop fighting? And that was, when I give a talk on this, I like open with a passage from my journal where I'm like puzzling over this, realizing, oh my gosh, the really difficult question isn't why do humans have war? It's obvious there's many pathways to make war pay. If you're,
Mm.
so like war isn't the really hard question in humans. The really hard question is how do you get rid of it?
Mm,
Um,
interesting. Yeah. So
yeah.
again, so just to be really clear from a cost benefit perspective, and this is recapitulates what we were just talking about, is from an evolutionary perspective, everything ultimately translates into there's got to be some benefit or minimization of cost for some software or phenotype to get selected for. And in the context of conflict, we just spent a bunch of time talking about, well, it might be this or that that gets ultimately this level of complexity of the software for conflict, but it's all for maximizing benefits, minimizing costs in the context of conflict, right? And then this question of sort of, well, how, when there's obvious benefits to conflict, do you get peace? That's the question.
Yeah, that's the question that, if you think about why did our species evolve some particular trait, then you look at costs and benefits over evolutionary timescales. And, war in humans is pretty simple. You can think that it just requires the capacity to form coalitions, to use aggression strategically, and then you get yourself in a situation where there's clear benefits from doing so. So
Yeah.
you have cultural institutions, but you may also capture, and it's common in many societies, including hunter-gatherers, things of value, weapons, physical trophies, captives, that and humans aren't morons like chimpanzees or most other species. We do so when the costs are typically pretty low through imbalances of power. So the most common type of attack across the ethnographic literature and decentralized conflict is the raid, where anywhere from 4 to 15 individuals, typically young males, in almost all cases, go out and use ambush and stealth to kill one or two individuals from another group. And at very, very low risk to themselves. And we don't have good like quantitative studies from many societies at all, but the few that we do suggest the risk is typically negligible.
Mm.
Chagnon, and I think it was just sort of an armchair estimation, said it was probably like less than 5%. Steve Beckerman's data among the Rani, which is like one of the most had the highest rates of homicide. It's more feuding than war at that point. He says that there's no record, nobody can recount an offensive raider getting
Mm.
attacked or
Wow.
killed.
Wow.
And my data from the Nangatom, it's very, very rare. People are more likely to die of thirst, so it's semi-arid than they are to be killed in the raid. In the couple of cases, it's typically like friendly fire or something like
Mm.
that. So, and it's because people are trying to minimize the danger to themselves, so the costs are pretty low with this pattern of conflict that we think of as ancestral.
Mm.
It's very similar to what you see in many other species, including chimpanzees. And the benefits in humans can be more proximate and tangible than, say, in chimpanzees. And maybe this really delayed mechanism in chimpanzee where after 10 years they take over the territory and they get access to new fruiting trees, which allows them to reduce their interbirth interval and have higher offspring survival. In humans, it may be much more like very direct. Like we steal your weapons, we have cultural mechanisms, so you kill someone, you get a new name, you get honorary tokens of your status, or you capture a human, a human child or a human wife. And then among pastoralists, you also get livestock, that, really tasty meat we were talking about.
Right. Yeah, and that cow is slaughterable and eatable and doesn't require, it's not like the land, right? Like
Yeah.
classically pastoralists or like shepherds or whatever else you're grazing or you're the it's the exclusivity and stealability. I'm using the wrong words, but but
Yeah.
basically how rival the goods are and how portable and packageable. I mean, it's the same reason why like money and diamonds, people try to steal them, but you don't try to steal like a whole building. You can't, like you
Hmm.
can't, you have to maintain it. It's the same with like a cropland versus
Yeah.
the results of the crops. Yeah, like the cow is the results of a lot of labor and resources, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the reasons I find what you're alluding to there, sort of competition for land, things that,
Mm,
are really a collective good, less satisfying for, explanations of human war. It's not
mm,
always clear, especially like in human conflict, where you can have these long, long periods of just like back and forth, tit for tat. And we don't have a lot of really good records of,
mm,
say, one, mobile hunter-gatherer group taking over the territory of another mobile hunter-gatherer group. That's sort of the hypothesis, but
mm,
as someone who's in the literature, I don't see as many of accounts of it
mm.
as I would like to. And instead, what I typically see are just sort of like back and forth, tit for tat rating for long periods of time without, concrete access to like, we have taken over this land and now over 10 years, we're going to have higher reproductive
Oh,
success,
I see. Okay.
so
So does that mean so like because typically like war, as like I think a lot of people, I mean like in Luke, I just want to like we went to a conference many years ago about the evolution of war and your pictures, it was like, wow, this Luke is very brave. Like there's people with AK-47s or Kalashnikovs like running around shooting them, like, but it's in this context of there's sort of two versions. One is the mongoose thing, right? Where it's sort of a lot of people together, and it's this asymmetric war of attrition, or it's just sort of sussing out which side will win. And even a lot of like mechanized war, like the Great Wars, even a lot of it was that, right? It was just sort of for territory. But it sounds like what you're saying is that that's not really the model you're seeing.
yeah, well,
It's
I would
other.
say I don't think that they're great models for thinking about the evolution of war in the
Mm,
human species.
mm,
Even monkeys, it shows that there can be a different path to,
right.
coalitionary killing, but where you think about just like, small parties operating. So if you just survey hunter-gatherer relationships, sort of as close to pre-contact as you can get, you find the most common pattern of
Mm,
intergroup killing is what we're describing, the raid, which is
I
similar
see.
to the chimpanzee patrol. A small group of individuals goes out at low cost to themselves. So I
Mm,
take that as sort of the baseline thing that we're trying to understand. And then culture and humans can put it in all different types of ways. Among the Nangatom, there are things like battles. Among the Turkana, things like battles. But I don't think that those are the real sort of like the window into our evolution. I think those are the product of new social technologies, which allow us to have larger population densities, more explicit or more established methods of incentivizing individuals,
Right.
either through rewards or coercion.
Right.
But if we're trying to understand the evolution of our species, I think what we really have to do is understand the pattern of small raids.
Right, like the Civil War soldier who just walks through the field getting shot at because the officer behind him will shoot him if he
Yeah.
doesn't. That's not a good that's not a good like intuition pump for how people ordinarily behave in
No,
conflict.
and no, one of the biggest things when I talk on the evolution war, everybody thinks, as rightfully so, you imagine what we think of as war, hierarchies and formal
Yes,
institution
exactly.
and coordination and some
Yeah,
larger strategy, but there's
yeah,
often no strategy. The strategy is there's tactics to that particular day, like surround the village, kill everybody, shoot them like dogs. There's no overarching strategy at all.
right.
Like, okay, we're gradually going to beat them back in this area, and then they're
Yeah,
going to migrate here, and we're going to have guys from that side come over. There's nothing really that I've ever personally seen like that, or really in the ethnography of decentralized small scale society. So like below the level of a chiefdom.
yeah,
So once societies start getting sort of formal leaders, they start transitioning to be a chiefdom, you do see things that like proto-militaries come up, and that resembles modern conflict or contemporary conflict much more.
So a lot of Hollywoodification maybe is like wait, I don't know. When you talk to people and you study war, do people have like weird thoughts about how it works or
Well, often they're really surprised when they when I tell them they have AK-47s, because I
yeah,
think that is things like, oh, they're gonna have spears and bows and arrows, and in the 21st century, that's really very, very rare. So there's a question I often face is how much did that sort of change the patterns of like indigenous war? And it it's sort of unresolvable because we don't have
yeah,
enough data. The earliest accounts show, similar small scale raids that you have now, sort of similar large scale battles. And by large scale, they're not large compared to us, but they're large for the level of social organization and population size. So they may involve 200 to 300 people on a side coming together on a given day and just sort of attacking by overwhelming force. But if anything, I think in this part of the world, it's made the small scale raids probably more common and more dangerous than they used to be, in the sense that like four guys can go out with, four AK-47s and not be nearly as afraid as like four
yeah,
guys with four spears.
right, right.
If
Did,
the
yeah.
goal is just to find a lone individual in the bush and shoot and
Yeah,
kill
yeah,
them.
you don't have to get as close. You don't have to, you
Hmm.
don't risk. Yeah. Did I hear you say too that also cell phones maybe even have more of a greater effect than the weapons?
Now, yeah, so cell phones are now becoming, common all over the globe. And I mean, they're both good for conflict resolution. Now they're used. So NGOs and governments everywhere will put like conflict monitors who
Yeah.
will call in, like we see them, they're slaughtering bulls, which is often something that pastoralists would do before when they're trying to motivate young men to go to a raid. They may kill a couple of bulls,
Mm,
and like, oh, we see them slaughtering bulls like red bulls or something, a bull that's like ritualistically associated with going to raid. So they may put out and call other groups, like have everybody be on heightened alert, have them sleep in the village, don't have people out in small herding parties. But then also reportedly, this isn't the case in the Nangatom at all, but so I've heard about, in Kenya, using it for the same, using it to share information about, say, where herds are that then you could raid. So when people are mobile and you're from one group, let's say you're from the Nangatom, you want to raid the Turkana, you don't really know necessarily where the villages are because people move around, or where the herds are because they're mobile. So you'll send out scouts. Big raiding parties are often preceded with scouts who will go out for several days, sort of living off the land, and come back and be like, okay, over by these mountains, I found fresh poop and some villages. So they're probably going to be over there. But if you can do that then with cell phones, it's even more efficacious.
right. So cell phones are just coordination devices. So
Yeah,
either
yeah.
for peace or conflict. Yeah.
Or for,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Interesting. So it seems like, there's a pretty big disconnect between, the types of intergroup violence that say the imbalance of power hypothesis would explain and the types of large scale warfare that we see in the historical record where like France and England will go to war and they'll have huge armies and that's very different from the types of small scale raids that you might see in the Turkana where like a group of male young men will try to gang up on a smaller number of people from another village. So we have that disconnect between presumably what the evolved psychology is designed for, which is low cost, low risk, raids where the benefit is really high, and then you have this totally different thing that happens once you get agriculture and civilization, and armies and kings and what have you. Um, is there a similar part of that analogy with regard to peace? So in the same way that we have large scale armies and civilizations and kings, do we also have large scale, peace treaties and international organizations that try to regulate interstate conflict. So we have that, large scale element of peace and negotiation and diplomacy. Is there a small scale version of that as well that's analogous to the small scale rating that we see?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I love that question. Yeah, so just to sort of recapitulate, first, I agree with you that the sort of like centralized conflict is really sort of discontinuous with the sort of small scale evolutionary raids. It uses some of the same psychological mechanisms, but it also uses things that are like really pretty novel. The ability of second lieutenants to stand at the back of a line and shoot would-be deserters. Um,
Mm,
but then with peace, do you have that same sort of discontinuity? And I think actually less so because I think
mm,
peace, as I sort of conceptualize it, where relationships are not negotiated individually, but sort of at the group level. I don't have to like sort of tentatively hang around with you and figure out if you're going to try to murder me in my sleep. I think they're really pretty novel in our
Mm.
species history. I think they depended on us first culturally evolving technologies that allow us to like enforce norms at the group level and then coordinate our behavior and make those norms known both within and between groups. So some of those things are, and then once you do have peace, the ability to try to make it so nobody from your side breaks the peace. And I just recently read The Guns of August, like a really famous sort of popular book about World War One, and I was struck by one of the things the author said is that right before the German invasion of Belgium and then France, France pulled its armies like 10 miles back, all their soldiers 10 miles back from the border because they were so concerned that one of their soldiers didn't sort of like strike the blow that set it off, that they wanted to be able to say it wasn't us, it was Germany. And that struck me as the reason it struck me is like, wow, that's a real sort of challenge that every society that wants to have peace has. Is like, let's say we're, three males among the Nangatom or hunter-gatherers, and like, I just want to live a good life, have my family. David P. Pinsoff wants to live a good, I realize you both have the same initial
Yeah,
last
we
name.
go David,
Also,
David. Yeah.
also
Yeah.
wants to live a good life and, just raise his family. But then, Santa Barbara Dave, he's the sort of like, nefarious one who's just like unsatisfied with his lot in life. What's to stop him from going out, raiding the other group? He doesn't even have to tell anybody but his closest friends from doing it, and then reinitiating us in this sort of cycle of violence. So
Mm.
the other group that's got raided isn't going to know, oh, it's just David P. He's, sort of a misanthrope. What he's doing doesn't really reflect anybody on it. All they see is like, hey, we had a state of peace and we got raided. So the central challenge for any human society that's going to have peace is how do we align our incentives enough so the sort of psychopaths or the people with impulse disorders or the people whose costs
mm,
and benefits are just a little, the cost and benefit calculus is either inaccurate or just doesn't favor peace. How do you keep them from initiating offensive aggression, at low cost to themselves when there may be very clear tangible benefits?
mm,
And this requires a level of centralization in cultural technologies that I think were pretty rare in for most of human history. So you need to be able to have norms at the group level saying, hey, this is not how we act to those to people of this particular group. And if we do, there's some sort of sanction for that. But it's difficult to get any type of sanctions like that among most mobile hunter-gatherer groups.
Hmm. It seems like it's interesting. It's almost like we need some kind of decomposition or de homogenizing. I don't know if that's a word or not, but to dehomogenize the group such that one member of the group is not a stand-in for everyone else
Yeah.
within that group. Because if that were the case, if one psychopath from that group came and did some damage or attacked us, then we would automatically infer that that person is representative of everyone else in that group, and we would retaliate not against that psychopath, but against the group itself as a singular entity. But in order to avoid that, we need some way of decomposing the group, away from this monolithic concept and toward a collection of parts. And we might represent the fact that this part is not a stand-in for the whole. Do you think that way
Yeah,
of conceptualizing group is part of this?
the decomposition isn't really something that often like happens in tribal societies, where
Yeah.
any action by any part of your group, the blame falls on all of the group. So the way this is
Hmm.
often resolved is turning over the killer. So Santa Barbara Dave, turning you over for the other group to dispatch justice, or what's more
Hmm.
common is us killing members of our in-group, killing the offender to show that that individual does not represent, that they're not representing the will of the group or the new norm. This is why peace is really, really difficult in tribal. So sustained peace, not just like periods of intergroup conflict, but sustained, iterated, durable, harmonious relationships, because it really breaks down very easily. And further that, many, many small scale groups have the cosmology where not just like Santa Barbara Dave goes out and attacks somebody from the other group, but somebody from the other group falls ill after Dave having made eye contact with them, and that it's war by
Mm.
mystical
Yeah.
means or by witchcraft, or
Mm.
just somebody's visiting from the other group Dave's village and falls sick and gets malaria and dies. How do you reassure the other group that it wasn't due to malevolent behavior by day? And this is something like in my own field work, I just saw a ton, like a Nangatom guy was like up trading in Mercy. And I guess he was old. Mercy is one of the rival groups they long hostilities with, and he died. And there was just endless discussions
Mm.
over the days over like trying to figure out what the cause of death was and whether there would be retaliation or not. And similarly, in the one sort of market town in Nangatom at that time, Kangaton, where there was a small health clinic, a woman from Turkana who had family in Nangatom, some of her family had married, came in and she was dying of HIV, came to the clinic to get treatment, and she ended up dying when she was there. I was like helping take her to the clinic and stuff, and there was just massive war. Like in the town, there was going to be retaliation by
Mm.
Kenya. So like I think the government, like the local government, sent somebody over to to the Kenya side to be like, she died at the clinic of,
Yeah.
dehydration or whatever at the clinic. It wasn't nefarious. So these are real problems that limit the ability of decentralized societies to make peace.
Mm.
Is that because so David, what was the verb you used to decompose or
Dehomogenize.
dehomogenize? I like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So to dehomogenize the groups, Luke, do you have an idea of why that is? So I mean, if you took like modern day France or Germany, if you like lived in France and your relative died in Germany currently, you wouldn't think, well, the Germany killed my French relative and I have to retaliate against Germany currently, right? You wouldn't think that.
Mhm.
You
But
might have 200 years ago. So,
yeah,
but
but do
like,
we
so
have a
yeah,
psycho? I mean, you would know, both of you would know better
yeah,
because you're psychologists, but
yeah.
don't we have a psychology where we sort of want to blame every individual of a group, attribute them some essence and blame them? I feel like this is sort of a fundamental feature of human psychology.
It
Where,
is. I mean, my answer to that
Yeah.
would be though that sort of comes back then to what group though, and this is for me at least the thing that really breaks all of this open is our ability to generate new group identities.
yeah.
Right. Like if I mean, and this is kind of what I was wondering is like, if you're stuck, like a good analogy would be like, we're in like battleships and we're like really stuck in them. We can't switch back and forth between them. and we can't even really like individuate the people within. So if like, if a missile comes over to us, it's sort of like there's no rational reason for me to individuate who did that because I can't do anything about it, you know? Um, and that's a very different situation than if I'm in a room full of people and we just have different color t-shirts on, and I'm a red t-shirted person, somebody's got a blue shirt on, and another red shirted person gets punched by a blue shirted person, we can choose like either it's reds versus blues, or we can sit down that red or that blue and not have a brawl, right? Because we're all sort of spatially together and we don't want to have to deal with like the escalation of conflict. But in the battleship condition, we really don't have a choice if we're going to respond at all. We're just sort of stuck because there's no chance of coordination. There's no value there's no possibility of coordination with the other side, right? Or
Yeah, I
cooperation.
think that that's a better model for sort of decentralized tribal societies. Is I mean, there is the
Mm,
possibility of coordination. It's just a lot harder. So you realize,
mm,
everybody's on foot. You may span your side may span a 5 days walk. So what does it actually take to even share information
yeah,
across your group, much less, develop a norm for behavior? I think there's real coordination problems in a way that we don't have
right.
in contemporary society. Plus, it's, often there's really different moral norms towards people outside the society. Many traditional societies, sort of the moral boundaries stop at your group, however your group is defined, and the things that you do against members of other groups don't have the same moral valence. Like it's, taking their property may not be called stealing in the way, with the word that you would use to describe it against an in-group member, or killing somebody, for instance, among the
Right.
Nangatom during the time of field work. If you killed another Nangatom, that's murder. You kill a Turkana, that's, that's war. That's just life. It's actually morally laudable in
Hmm.
most conditions. So I
Right.
think I
Like your
strayed a little
example,
bit
yeah.
away from your
No,
question.
no, no, that's great. And I mean, yeah, no, even your example of you're working in the water pit or you're digging a
Yeah.
hole, right? And they're like excited. I mean, that's even like I experienced that where, they were talking about, oh, we got this cow, that's wonderful. And I was like, you guys, they're gonna retaliate again, like, and
Yeah.
that's the different setting on our evolved psychology, right? Of like, and it's this thing of like this battleship metaphor where it's sort of like, well, I'm never going to interact with somebody in the out group. There's no benefit to me to quelling them. They're just like a resource. They're just like a fruit tree to be,
Um,
like there's no future possibility of interaction.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this is what I think about, peace is the solution to a collective action problem, to a really hard
Mm,
collective action problem, because you have
yeah.
people like young men who say, "Oh, there's no possibility. I have no interest in cooperating with the Turkana. I just want cows. I want fame. I'm
Yeah.
16. I'm stuck watching these cows, and I want to be a famous warrior." But then you have people who have really seen a lot, and they realize exactly what you thought is like, "Hey, if you did this to them, they're just going to do it to us, and we're going to be locked into this just like cycle that's, really difficult to break free." So you have these internal
Hmm.
tensions within
Yeah.
society and even within the same individual. Like, does that person want peace or not? Well, it may depend on the particular time of them, for them, like, the day of the week, or even potentially their mood, shaped by more recent events. So society
Yeah.
has to figure out a way to solve these things and come to a consensus, and then to generate a norm, and then the
Mm,
ability to enforce that norm, make sure everybody has knowledge of the norm, including the other side.
So it's common knowledge. Yeah.
Yeah.
And also time horizon, I would expect, more, future oriented members of the society might be more in favor of peace, more present oriented members of the society, like young men who are trying to impress a girl, like they're very present oriented and they want what's best for them right now. They're not thinking about, 20 years into the future. And so the degree to which the society is inclined to conceptualize those future costs that might not happen now, but in a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades, that ability is probably also a variable, I would imagine. Um,
Yeah, so you'll have like, when peace is starting to come about through being built, you'll often have like prominent leaders berating the young men, don't go on a raid,
Mm,
absolutely not. You're
Hmm.
going to break the peace, it's going to be horrible. You'll have, sort of shaman or religious or ritual specialists not
Hmm.
bless the men. Typically you may get a blessing before you go on a raid, so
Interesting.
they'll agree at a peace meeting, let's say, we're not going to bless the young men who want to raid. In some cases in the ethnography, you find, and I haven't seen this, I've just read it, where if they detect young men going on a raid, so Santa Barbara Dave decides, oh, he doesn't care, he doesn't need blessings, he's still going to go to a raid. Sorry to pick on you, Dave.
no, it's great.
He's just gonna go a raid. He's gonna get his best friends. They're not gonna tell anyone. They're gonna sneak off. So he arranges, okay, meet me down at the ocean, in 3 hours. And they
Hmm.
find Dave and his friends and may actually physically beat him to get him withdraw his plans of
Hmm.
going on a raid. So there can be really, complicated social dynamics that have to be solved to, get everybody's incentives to align. And
Yeah.
Interesting. I want to pick your brain about a topic that is very interesting to me. I think also interesting to Dave, which is the role of moralization, pretext, ideology, narrative, whatever. There are lots of words we might use for this. You mentioned that it's not seen as immoral to kill or steal from an outgroup member, but it is to kill or steal from an in-group member. You mentioned how sometimes intergroup conflicts are precipitated by accusations of witchcraft. If someone falls ill, they might blame it on sorcery from members of a rival group, and that might, in some cases, precipitate or justify the conflict. Have you thought much about the role of justification or moralization or even demonization of the rival group as a way to coordinate intergroup violence? What are the role of these ideas, these beliefs, these narratives, these pretexts? Do you think that they play an instrumental role, or do you think they're more of a modern phenomenon? Have you thought
Yeah,
much about
so I
that?
don't think they're a modern phenomena, but I think the
Okay.
question is whether they're causal.
Yeah.
So there's certainly, dehumanization language. They're savages. They're like
Hmm.
animals. They're horrible. Remember all the time. We just did the victim complex. Remember all the times they did this, this, and this, and this.
Okay.
Without remembering the times you did that, 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 and then to
Hmm.
them, there's all sorts of slurs that are used just like in our society. So those certainly they certainly are very present. I think there's probably something present across almost all human societies, or at least small scale societies that are engaging in intergroup conflict. And they certainly seem to be associated with people getting aroused, with people having a feeling of that there was a grievance against them. I just don't know whether they're necessary, like how much
Hmm.
causal work they do. You can certainly have high rates of lethal violence in, say, chimpanzees without anything like that.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
so maybe
Yeah.
there's sort of an epiphenomena,
Yeah.
but I
Yeah.
don't,
I
I
mean,
don't
well,
know. That would be
yeah.
something for the lab to like,
For sure.
Yeah.
see
Yeah.
more sort of
Yeah.
engagement experimentally.
Yeah, I mean, my current thinking is that it may well play a strong causal role in the sense that, chimpanzees may not need it because they don't have the same kind of social marketplace and reputation management that humans do. And among humans, we have very strong social norms and moral norms to be, peaceful and friendly and generous with members of the group. And insofar as one is bloodthirsty and vengeful toward outgroups, that could license a variety of inferences about that person's character. And if we're all, acting in a way that is, activating those inferences in one another's, there could be, reputational costs to trying to mobilize outgroup aggression in the absence of any kind of moral justification or in the absence of any kind of pretext. And it may make it easier to coordinate and punish free riders and defectors from the collective action if we have a common narrative that justifies the collective action versus if we don't.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds plausible. I just don't know how much you actually need that in universes where your moral boundaries really do stop at your people. I mean, I just think
Yeah.
the ethnographies are just, replete with examples of strangers being killed on site, women and children being killed. It during my field work, there was a kid in my village who was killed and mostly beheaded, and like I had no doubt that the other group was absolutely celebrating, just
Yeah.
as people in my group would have been doing in the
Yeah.
same circumstances were reversed. Or, there was a case where, a raiding party encountered a young kid of the other group and they wanted to kill, and there's discussion, not that it's moralized, and they decided to
Yeah.
bring him back as a captive. And one of them was like, just so upset because it was his chance to get scars,
Yeah.
honorific scars, or
Yeah.
um it I had another example I was going to tell, but I can't remember. Like your moral universe really does is often limited to just people of your own group. And it's not always even that you acknowledge them as less than human. You may think they're fully human. You invite them. So think of the treacherous feast that,
Yeah.
Shagnon writes so much about. Like you recognize them as fully human, motivated by the same things you're motivated by.
Yeah.
That you want to come hang out and have a party and, get drunk and, meet prospective mates. And you know this enough about your enemy that you construct this elaborate ruse to invite them over.
Mhm.
So it sounds plausible. I just don't know how much it applies in this universe. And it was one of the things that sort of as
Yeah.
an anthropologist was like the most difficult to wrap my head around, is that,
Yeah.
I never worried about any Negatom doing anything to me, but I worried, say, if I wanted a guy from the Hammer, a different ethnic group who's often enemies in the Negatom, to come visit me in my village.
Yeah.
How, to what extent would he be safe? And I knew, okay, he'd often be totally safe when he's with me, but what about if he goes out to use the bathroom, and encounters somebody who doesn't know him, or somebody who's just really upset at, and wants the insignia that comes from killing somebody.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm I'm wondering if the boundedness of the moral universe is actually an example of the type of thing I'm talking about, that actually requires work and coordination to create that boundedness. And we need to perpetuate the idea that there is a distinction there, that, morality applies to our group, but not to the other group. And if you aggress against the outgroup, then we're not going to negatively judge you. And I think there may well need to be a kind of cultural coordination about that fact itself that enables the violence to occur. If there wasn't any coordination to that effect, where there would be doubts about whether I might be doing something morally wrong by attacking a member of their group, then I think that could very well destroy the ability of the group to engage in collective action. So it may be that that boundedness is itself part of the thing I'm talking about that enables the violence to take place. So it may not be a given or an automatic or something that just automatically applies. It may itself require work to maintain.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to understand, I've lost
Yeah.
you, is why do you need this extra thing to do violence? Like, why, we like, is the idea that we're just like innately inhibited from killing others? Is that,
Uh, Not that we're innately inhibited, that we're innately inclined to draw inferences about each other's character based on
okay?
their behaviors and their words and deeds. And wanton violence, it may feed into those inference systems, such that we're inclined to judge someone who is wantonly violent as a cruel person. And therefore, we're going to be less willing to partner up with that person, cooperate with them. We might be more afraid of that person, et cetera, et cetera. So, what I'm talking about is the type of inferences that we're inclined to draw about one another based on their behavior. And oftentimes, when we engage in a violent outgroup attack, we can't turn off that machinery. We're going to be making inferences about everyone who's involved in that collective action. We're going to be making inferences about the people who propose it, the leaders who lead it, the people who are most bloodthirsty within it. And the only way to deactivate those inferences is to replace them with a different set of inferences. That instead of the person being bloodthirsty and cruel, they're brave and valiant. Instead of the person being exploitative toward the outgroup, they're helping the in-group. Instead of someone attacking an outgroup member for no reason, they're retaliating against all the evil things that group did to us in the past. And if we change those inferences, then it actually changes the incentives to engage in the collective violence, because not only are you getting the material benefits of, say, cattle or resources or territory or whatever, you're also gaining social benefits and reputational benefits, and those social benefits might be instrumental to the collective action itself. And without those social benefits, there might not be enough of an impetus to engage in it. And at least that's how I'm currently thinking of it. I might be wrong, but I think there might be something to it.
Yeah, can I mediate this? Because I think I agree
Sure.
with both of you. And I think so. Let me try to. Okay, so
No.
I think for Luke, and both of you tell me if I'm wrong. So I think Luke is coming in this from the perspective of like, if you look across the animal kingdom, basically like conflict, to be just kind of glib about it, is everywhere. And as long as you're not hurting me, David, if you hurt some other guy that I'm not really interested in and doesn't isn't my best friend, and especially if I don't even know him, like more power to you, whatever, right?
Yeah.
Like, so as soon as there's sort of like any anonymity and we're not a super cooperative species, then like whatever, yeah, go for it. He's a resource, and if you're a cooperator with me, so like I don't care if you're belligerent, more or less, right?
Yeah.
And I think from Luke's perspective, then thinking about this scaled up is that if we have sort of these pockets of coordination or cooperation where we're sort of all in these ships or these small scale social worlds, it's really not surprising that like where the boundaries of this coordination exist, then any member outside this group is just sort of not seen as in the moral sphere, right? Like just as Luke's talking about. Now, and so what you need to explain then is how do you get out of that? Now, David, what I think you're explaining, I completely also agree with, is that once you already take the perspective of human psychology that's already engaged in the fact that you're already using that cultural technology, and there are people who are saying, look, if we do take the cows, they're going to retaliate. So let's have a conversation about what group identity we should all agree with, or whether we should be belligerent. And especially like me as a human being who has grown up in a cultural milieu where I'm like lucky enough and privileged enough to be like the whole world is the cooperative unit, right? Like, so I totally get the intuition that like seeing somebody be belligerent is bad and like it's really short-sighted. And I even felt that when Luke was saying that example about like the cow, right? And people celebrating and praising the belligerent. But I think that, and I agree with that 100%. And I think that is a true readout of the evolved psychology. But I would think that Luke would say that's a readout of the evolved psychology that's gone through this experience of the inputs of we're going to talk about the moral boundary being more malleable and being larger, such that we're going to sort of like have a higher prior that any kind of belligerence is sort of frowned upon. How do you guys feel about that?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. I mean, let me backtrack a little bit and maybe try to put forward a weaker version of the thesis, which is that it may be that you only see this sort of thing in modern social environments, where the necessity of pretexts and ideologies and moralistic narratives is much higher in large, anonymous, um, highly sedentary societies. And I'm thinking of the work of Joshua Jackson showing that we're more inclined to draw a sweeping variety of inferences about someone's character based on a single action that they perform. I forget what the term he uses for this, but we basically we view morality as like a singular dimension. And if you do one bad thing, then you're bad across the board. You know, if you happen to lie, then you're also probably a bad spouse. You're also probably a bad parent. You're a bad friend, and we just view you as a bad person in general. Whereas you don't see this kind of sweeping inference being made in small scale societies where, yeah, maybe you lied this one time, or maybe you were mean to this one person, but that doesn't mean you're a bad person across the board. And his argument is that because we have such huge social networks, and the social options available to us are much larger, we're sort of forced to make these these sweeping inferences as a kind of heuristic. In the same way that if we're bewildered in a shopping market full of different products, we don't have time to individually inspect every individual product and look at all the features. We just make inference. Oh, I like this brand. I don't like this brand. It's generally a good brand. I generally don't like this. We do the same thing socially. I mean, this is just a generally bad person. I don't really pay a lot of costs for just excluding that person because I have so many other social options in my universe. And so it might be because we're so inclined to make these promiscuous social inferences across people in the modern world with these large social networks that proposing or engaging in outgroup violence is more likely to result in reputational damage in the modern world than it might have in a small scale society. I'm willing to entertain the hypothesis that maybe this sort of phenomenon is unique to modern social environments. But yeah, that's sort of how I'm thinking of it. I'm curious what you think, Luke.
Yeah, that sounds like something that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, for one, as an anthropologist, the lesson that
Yeah,
was given to me, you can never make an enemy no matter what. And now I
yeah,
realize, like in small scale societies, you can never like burn a bridge or fully extract yourself from a relationship because the webs of interdependence are just so deep. Like you, even if somebody, I mean, somebody may be recognized as a psychopath. Somebody goes like crazy far in war and kills a whole bunch of people or kills cows, for instance, or
yeah,
something to recognize like that dude is a psychopath, but it doesn't mean it's moralized in the same way. But you may recognize like, oh, we don't want to listen to that guy when our group is trying to decide what we should do in war, whether we should retaliate with a battle or whether we should migrate somewhere else. But also, yeah, then I was going to say that the time where I think it really might become a little bit more moralized is when there is peace with another group. And
Right.
you can
mm,
fully expect that if you go and kill somebody else, so there's been a peace meeting and an agreement, the
mm,
two parties have come together, they've broken spears, they've eaten together, it's common knowledge, which essentially
yeah,
this resets the prisoner's dilemma. So it's
yeah,
common knowledge, then and you go and kill somebody, that's probably going to be moralized, not necessarily because it's bad or to kill that person, but it's bad because it broke the peace.
Right.
mm,
Can
yeah,
I so let me see if I can define peace as you've defined it to just make it explicit. So what I've heard you say basically it's peace is preempting like a acute predatory um conflict or just predation. And that's out of an interest in either minimizing costs or expanding benefits. Is
Well, I don't
that
think it has to be. I define it as like a state of like relatively harmonious, durable interactions where there's not the expectation of violence, or if violence or aggression occurs,
Hmm.
it's aberrant.
Okay, good. So let me clarify then. I think what I wasn't doing is defining peace, but maybe the engine or what's the cost benefit logic, bringing this back full circle. What's the cost benefit logic of the individual agents to engage in peace or for there to even be the opportunity for sort of cultural norms or for the evolution of these norms and institutions? And is it this idea that with this time horizon, as David talked about, and with this idea of we can think about the possible costs and benefits and say, look, there's more of a benefit to not being belligerent right now, on average, for most of us. So let's all agree, let's produce common knowledge such that even when any one of us sort of pops up as the variant, the alternate, where it's sort of like, no, no, I really want to kill that group, you've sort of all agreed ahead of time and there's common knowledge we've all agreed that on average for all of us we're going to be better off.
Yeah, but then you need some sort of mechanism to enforce that
Right.
outlier whose cost benefit calculus
Right. Right.
is different. And this
Yeah.
is this is why it's really, I mean, it's hard to get. You have to have some sort of level of centralization
I
to like
see. I see.
pull all this knowledge to
I
come up
see.
with a norm to have the enforcement mechanism.
I
So
see. So
there's
it's not just seeing the prospect for it and getting everybody to agree, which are already two really hard things.
yeah.
But it's also, as you just said, the enforcement mechanism.
Yeah. Yeah, so one of the things I realized early on is many people could see the benefits for peace. They could see
Mm,
like if only we could stop fighting, like we'd all be better off. Because often what happens is you end up
mm,
with, say, big no man's lands where everybody's
right.
scared to go in, and so underuse of resources,
Yeah.
you lose access to potential reproductive partners, trading partners. It typically, results in like, net costs for both sides.
Yeah.
Like at
Yeah.
average, while you may have a few outliers, benefit. So you have people realize this, but it's just a matter of like coordinating to sort of solve that prisoner's dilemma or solve that collective action problem.
Mm,
So it's multiple layers, which is why I think it's rare. So among hunter-gatherers, you have often instances of like intergroup cooperation, but I think they typically don't rise to the level often among, so this is, as close to contact as we can get or the records of peace because they're frequently broken by conflict or their relationships that sort of exist dyadically. I know you, so I interact peacefully with you, but if I meet someone else from your group, I have to negotiate that relationship individually.
right.
But just the idea that we can come together as members of the group and fully expect to be treated, with norms that involve non-violence or non-aggression is it's a really high bar.
Okay.
But I think this is one of the things that's most sort of overlooked in thinking about the evolution of our species, particular cultural evolution, because intergroup exchange is one of the, engines that drives cultural evolution. So once we solve this problem, we have the capacity to unlock positive sum relationships or positive sum benefits from every potential
Mm,
intergroup relationship.
I see.
So it
Hmm.
can fuel tons and tons of cumulative cultural evolution that, in since you don't, the difference between us and chimpanzees, partly one of them is just that we solve the problem of intergroup relationships, which allow us then to, turn on the engine of cumulative cultural evolution.
Hmm.
Right. Yeah.
That reminds me of something you wrote in your evolution of peace paper that jumped out at me, which is that the same factors that lead to intergroup peace are often the same factors that lead to the increased scale and destructiveness of conflict when it does occur. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that idea.
Yeah, there's this really ironic, sort of tragic logic to peace that, we just assume peace is the absence of conflict, not realizing it's the product of cultural technologies that allow us to coordinate norms, enforce those norms. But once you have that capacity, you can turn it into, instead of coordinating a norm for nonviolence and sanctioning people that, preemptively use violence, you can turn it into a norm for, say, aggression against the outgroup and sanction those who don't participate. So, as you have increasing socio-political complexity, you get the greater opportunity for peace, but you also get the greater opportunity for violence, coordinated violence for war.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I
That's
think it's a really new way of thinking about peace and human evolution as, both, a cultural technology that we had to make. We made it. So I
right.
think the better way instead of the evolution is like the invention of peace. We invented it. We invented these technologies allowing us to solve these coordination problems. And then when they're in
Interesting.
place, like it really fully unlocks the full potential of our species.
That's interesting. Hmm.
You can imagine like, we're a species where we live in 1,000 member groups, but they're really sort of isolated and bounded, with not a lot of trade or relationship. Occasionally marriage partners are exchanged,
Yeah.
young women, but they're not bringing the full repertoire of group knowledge. You imagine cumulative cultural evolution is just much, much smaller in that scenario. So I think it's one of the critical aspects, us being able to solve this problem is one of the critical aspects of our
Hmm.
species history.
Right. And just to be explicit about it, because we haven't talked a ton about like the interaction between biological and cultural evolution, the idea is that if you take this evolved psychology, that's sort of like, well, I want to minimize my costs, maximize my benefits. And you might be in this culture where you look around and you're like, we'd all be better off if there was more peace, but I don't know. What am I going to do about it? Right? Like, I can't
Yeah.
do anything about it. But the idea is that all that same feeling is felt by people everywhere. And for different reasons that are partially historic, partially accidental, partially ecological, whatever, there might be there's just trial and error or people trying to create institutions. And somewhere, sometime, one works a little bit better that allows people to sort of like have an agreement or create a technology to see those benefits, somehow create a social institution that creates a penalty system that everybody agrees with. And then once that happens, those people are doing better. And the people that are near those people see that and are like, oh, that looks good. I'll take that. Or they have more stuff or both. And then the evolved psychology hasn't changed, but because everybody's evolved psychology is looking at their neighbor and being like, oh, they're doing better, or maybe they take you over because they're doing better. Either way, like you eventually adopt what they're doing.
Yeah, so I would say two things. One, like that's the scenario, and I didn't touch on this much in the paper. I just like ran out
It's
of
yeah,
space, but it's
yeah,
something I really want to visit. Is
yeah.
you do have this ratchet effect. Is like once you solve this problem, you're going to be more successful, meaning you're going to both outcompete those groups that don't have it, but your ideas are going to be borrowed. But at the same time, a critical mechanism of peace in the small scale societies is the execution of not people who are proactively aggressive, like Richard has in Demonic
Mm,
Males, the self-domestic, but people that break the peace. So this is really, really common once you get the capacity to enforce peace. So, and the same thing, it can continue to ratchet up our evolved psychology, say for, impulse control, for tolerance. So it's the same sort of mechanism he posits, but instead of against reactive aggression, it's against people who may use aggression strategic or physical violence strategically.
mm.
So in that sense, I think
Like
our
literally the
evolves,
execution.
yeah, like
Yeah,
literally the
yeah.
execution. This is all over the case because you need to signal to the other group that you don't endorse that
Right,
the behavior, is not reflective of your group. You need to reset,
right,
the prisoner's dilemma. So
right.
this is very, very common. So I think in that sense, you may have a ratcheting up of our actual evolved psychology as well once we created the first sort of like proto piece.
Mm.
Hmm. Could it be that also, the imbalance of power hypothesis rears its ugly head once you start creating these social technologies? So, insofar as you create peace and networks of mutual cooperation, and you grow the size and scale of your society and the layers of mutually beneficial cooperation and technology, well, all of a sudden, once you get that peace happening, and you get a larger and more complex society, and you look and you see your neighbor is not nearly as complex or as coordinated or as large as you, well, all of a sudden you've created a really large spectacle of an imbalance of power, and you can use all of that machinery that was formerly used to creating peace and unification, and harness it to dominating and conquering the next guy in the neighboring territory. Do you buy that that is also a mechanism that might be part of this?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think. One of the things that really puzzle myself over is sometimes why you don't see more conquest among small scale societies. In particular, like
Mm.
I think a puzzle that hasn't been explained is the emergence of like patron-client relationships
Mm.
between groups. In many cases, the client doesn't actually even necessarily have much to offer, where you may have
Sure.
like small groups of horticulturalists or forager horticulturalists surrounded by really powerful groups that do wage war and not be like immediately wiped out
Right.
or assimilated.
Yeah. 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 So he was just saying patron. Yeah. Well. Yeah.
Patron client relationships. You have, ethnography's got lots of examples of sort of like small Pacific groups, like forager horticulturalists that don't have much means of organizing for a war, nor do they have much of a history, surviving and persisting around larger, more bellicose groups. And sometimes they form patron client relationships where they'll offer a specific type of service, such as, products from the forest or building dugout canoes. But in many cases, they don't. They just seem to sort of like subsist nearby, and engaging in,
Interesting.
occasional trade or more typically the, provision of female marriage or partners from the sort of smaller, weaker group to the more powerful Pacific group.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I bet it would depend on the nature of the resources and the resource distribution and the type of resources that, the large scale society might need to expand, if it's just a matter of land or lumber or ore
Yeah.
or whatever, and there's plenty of that in the neighboring territory, why not just kill everyone and take it? But if people in the neighboring territory have knowledge that is really useful, they know how to make something, then it might be cheaper
Yeah.
just to trade with them than to take them over, because if you kill them, you're going to destroy all that knowledge. And so
Mhm.
I would imagine that ecology also plays an important role in this as well.
Yeah, it's one of the things that, I love being an evolutionary anthropologist, but we really need so many more tight quantitative studies. And, our window to do those for these questions is really past. We can work with ethnographic documents at sort of large scale and EHRAF and other repositories, but, they're only so fine-grained. And there's really just like so few societies now that have sort of like, non-state patterns of interaction that are, truly subsistence that I just sometimes get a little frustrated that we really are sort of confined to most speculation, except for the stuff that we can build models and test, against, or we can test in the lab. But, a lot of what we're talking about now is just, speculation.
Yeah. We had Zach Garfield on just recently.
Okay.
He talked about you and he working on the Omo Valley research project.
Mhm.
He talked a lot about it and how you're actually doing all this cool stuff, sponsoring students in education. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so yeah, it's something I'm very excited about, very proud of because, as an anthropologist, my career is enabled by the generosity and kindness of the host communities. And my research specialization was for my dissertation was war. I work much more broadly on just human sociality now. But so people often focus on that while ignoring the fact that these are like people just like you and me.
Yeah.
Their culture is vibrant, they have relationships, they fall in love, they grieve, they mourn, they have friendships. And I have friends with I'm good friends with many people from the communities I worked with, and really glad to finally reach a point in my career with Zach where we're able to start thinking about ways to give back. And we try to do so in an anthropologically minded way of trying to give them what they request and need instead of saying, oh, here's a
Mm.
village, they need a pump, and now we can be done with it.
Right.
And what people commonly ask for is that, the students from their communities that have made it through high school, but, so in Ethiopia, unlike Kenya, there's no fees for going to elementary school or high school. And there's very, very few students from these pastoralist communities who have made it through high school, but then college is just incredibly prohibitively expensive. They have to
Mm.
pay fees or they have to move to a city somewhere, pay for lodging, pay for transportation, pay for food. So we provide scholarships for these students. Typically, we also provide a computer for them, and we're funding something like 23 students right now in scholarships, including the first doctor from the Nangatom and from the Omo Valley who is doing his internship here. So he finished his MD, and then after that, you do a year of like internships working on different specializations. And we have a website. And if anybody out there is interested in this project, like it's an opportunity for your money to go directly to supporting the student of a scholarship for a student who would not be in school otherwise. Even $10, $15 would help. It's called the Omo Valley Research Project. You can check it out online. You can also send me an email.
Yeah,
We
we'll
did our
put
first
we'll put in the show notes.
yeah,
Yeah.
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 We did a workshop this summer. Zach might have told you about like a digital skills workshop, bringing together all of our
Mm.
students for a couple of days, just training them on the stuff a lot of, I think, my undergrads need, like how to leverage Google Suite, for instance, working on writing a resume, making a cover letter, providing feedback to each other. And it's really amazing to be the point in my career where we can actually like provide tangible benefits to these communities who have given us and I would say all of the anthropological community. Like if you're reading my papers and Zach's paper, you're the beneficiary of what these communities have given us.
Yeah, it's so cool and so wonderful, and I really like what you said about that it's anthropological in the sense of you have to first understand or listen to them and say here, ask them what they want, and not just sort of patronizingly or just sort of helicopter in and drop something off. That's not at all what
Yeah.
they need. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Super cool
So
stuff.
Yeah, so thanks for having me on.
Yeah,
Really enjoyed talking to you.
yeah, thanks. Is there anything we should have asked you? We have to ask that question. We covered
So
a lot
I
of
feel,
ground. It went quick.
yeah. So I feel like podcasts, I often like when they end up with when they end, and not that you asked me, but it was something I think about emailing. It's a forward-looking question. So like,
Yeah,
what are you working on now? What are the biggest questions in our field that need to be
yeah,
answered? What are some like
yeah,
methodological advances that you're really excited
yeah,
about?
yeah. Yeah,
So
those are
those are
great
things I think.
questions. You should have you got a spot anytime you want one. No,
Yeah.
actually, that was something that Gervin said too. And we actually are thinking about having some folks on, returners on, and so maybe, yeah. But do you want to ta tackle one of those real quick that you just
Oh,
asked?
well, so what I'm working on now is really two things. I'm working on a book manuscript trying
Mm,
to sort of describe some of my own personal fieldwork experiences and puzzling through these questions from going in as a sort of like more serious not biological determinist, but a behavioral ecological approach to war and balance of power to really sort of thinking about the cultural mechanisms that, that explain the vast variation you have between societies and war and peace. So that's the thing I'm really excited about right
yeah,
now. It's
that's
a
fantastic.
larger writing project.
Fantastic. We'll have to have you back when it's ready and
Yeah,
Yeah.
well,
we'll
hopefully
get into it.
that's within the next 5 years.
I have a
Yeah.
title for you. I have a title for you. You should call it War and Peace. I don't think there's any book that's got that
Yeah,
title in
yeah,
it.
yeah,
That's a great
yeah.
idea.
Yeah,
No,
great.
the tentative
Short,
title
short.
actually is Enemy Eaters
Ooh.
because among tribal societies, many times eating is a verb that does a lot of work. It's
Mm.
so common. So, and if you become a famous warrior in Nangatom, you become known as an enemy eater, like you ate your enemies. And if you want to go to war, you're like so hungry, like I want to eat them, I want to devour them. So that's sort of the working title I could think about it. And who knows what it will actually end up with. But it
Uh,
captures so much more about sort of like the cultural instantiation of war as a set of values.
yeah, it's fantastic. Well, Luke, I mean, you could not take a more important topic, war and peace. And you are you are a brave person for exposing yourself to danger, going out into the field. We all benefit from you going out and doing it as well, and as well as all the people that you work with. And so thank you for being that conduit. We wouldn't know about all of them if it wasn't for you. So thank you for doing that work, and thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys. Good talking to you and I enjoy your show.
Oh,
Thank you.
thanks, Luke. Yeah, we'll have you on another time.
All right.
Yep.
Bye bye.
All right. David, what can people do to make the world better slash support this podcast?
Well, they can say kind things about us on social media. They can leave us a kind review. They can visit us on Patreon, and they can contact us with any ideas for topics or questions or guests.
Yeah, somebody commented that I think I say too often, which is a fair point, and I'm working on it. And if we had more time to edit them out, that would be great. If anybody wants to
Yeah.
edit them
Yeah,
out,
if anyone
that's
wants
great.
to go through and individually edit out every
Yeah,
we would pay you $0 to do that.
exactly. So I've occasionally edited out some ums of the guest or myself or you, David, but it's
Oh
very
yeah.
infrequently. Yeah, yeah.
Well, I mean, that's actually a good incentive for people to support us on Patreon
Oh
because if
yeah,
we
because
raise
we get
enough
paid.
money,
Oh, we should be saying more ums and ahs and
yeah. So if
interstitials. Yeah.
you are disappointed with the frequency of ums and uhs,
Mm.
here's what you can do
Carrot,
to change that.
carrot.
You
Yes.
can give us some money on Patreon, and
Yeah.
if we raise enough money, we
We
could
can
hire someone
to
to
edit.
edit us and make us sound smarter than we are.
Yeah, I mean, these are very like you might be surprised or completely unsurprised. These episodes are often not edited at all.
That's true. Yeah.
Some are, but the vast majority are almost not.
Yes, you are getting the unfiltered truth
Yeah.
from Dave and David. Unedited, raw.
Yeah. I think everyone's like, well, this outro was definitely not edited. So, yeah. But anyway, yes, thank you for listening. Please support us. And yes, if you're particularly perturbed about my ums, I'm working on it. But yes, also please support us on
Yeah, that,
Patreon or
yeah,
or reach out to guest edit.
yeah. Do
Okay.
all those things. All
All
right,
right.
see you next week.
See you next week. Yeah. Great.